Good evening all, and welcome back to FEAR NOX. In the Appalachian backcountry, nights fall fast. Fog settles in the hollers, wet leaves hide the rock underfoot, and the ridgelines echo with short sounds that don't match the trail maps. When county trucks and volunteer teams head out after dark, even familiar routes feel different. Tighter, quieter, and harder to trust. A ridge camera catches the same unit twice, moving the same direction an hour apart. Creek noise grows louder the higher you climb. A service gate latches from the wrong side. 11 lights march through fog on a trail that's been closed for years. And a cairn knocked flat at dusk stands rebuilt by midnight, stone for stone. Tonight's stories come from ranger logs, SAR debriefs, trail cameras, and night grid reports pulled from the Blue Ridge during late fall. One case in this set was almost removed from the record. You'll understand why when we reach it. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. We post every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the channel grow. All right, let's get into it.
I was assigned to the night shift dispatch desk when Deputy Miller's welfare check call came in. It was late autumn, a few hours past midnight, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. The first small irregularity was a GPS ping showing his unit turning onto a private logging spur. My role that night was routine, monitoring the radio and tracking units across our county's vast, forested stretches. Deputy Miller was a steady presence, known for his methodical approach to calls. The welfare check was for an elderly resident in a remote cabin, a few miles off the main highway, a common occurrence in our isolated region. These calls often involved checking on someone who hadn't been heard from in a few days, especially as the weather turned colder. The forest around us was dense, a mix of pine and hardwoods, and the gravel roads could be treacherous with frost or fog. Our dispatch system showed each unit as a small icon on a digital map, a constant hum of data flowing into the station. Deputy Miller had acknowledged the call with his usual calm tone over the radio. He reported his estimated arrival time, then confirmed he was turning onto the long, winding access road to the cabin. The GPS track showed his unit proceeding normally for about 10 minutes. Then, the icon on my screen diverged from the mapped public road. It veered sharply onto a narrow, unpaved track, marked clearly as a private logging spur. This spur was known to be closed to public access, used only by the timber company during active operations. I saw the deviation immediately. I tried to raise him on the radio, but received only static. The signal in that particular hollow was always unreliable. I noted the discrepancy in the logbook, assuming he had taken a shortcut or misread his directions in the dark. It was not unheard of for deputies to use old logging trails if they knew them to be passable, especially when time was a factor on a welfare check. I made a mental note to follow up once he was back in range. A few minutes later, the GPS signal dropped entirely. This was also not unusual for that area, a deep pocket of dead zones. I waited for his unit to reappear on the map, expecting it to pop back up once he cleared the hollow or reached higher ground. An hour passed, then another. The welfare check was overdue. I initiated a standard procedure, attempting to contact him every 15 minutes. Each time, the radio remained silent, filled only with the low whisper of static. The cold outside seemed to seep into the dispatch room. I pulled up the last known GPS coordinates and cross-referenced them with the county's topographical maps. The spur led into a particularly dense section of the forest, far from any established trail or public access point.
It was a place where the trees grew thick and the light never fully penetrated, even during the day. When Deputy Miller still hadn't checked in after a few hours, I escalated the situation. I contacted the watch commander, explaining the GPS anomaly and the lack of radio contact. A search was initiated. Our first step was to review any available surveillance footage from the area. The logging company maintained a series of motion-activated cameras along their private roads, primarily to monitor equipment and prevent trespassing. One camera, positioned on a ridge overlooking the main spur, was of particular interest. The company provided us with the digital files. We began reviewing the footage, frame by frame. The camera showed Deputy Miller's patrol unit, clearly identifiable, driving inward on the private spur. His headlights cut through the night fog, bright and distinct. The timestamp on the photograph confirmed it was shortly after his GPS had first diverged. The vehicle moved at a steady, cautious pace, appropriate for the rough gravel track. We continued watching, expecting to see him emerge eventually, perhaps turning around after realizing his mistake. But he never did. Instead, about an hour later, the same camera captured another image. It was Deputy Miller's unit again, traveling in the exact same direction as before, further into the forest, deeper down the private spur. This time, however, the headlights appeared noticeably dimmer, almost muted by the night. The vehicle's speed seemed slightly different too, a subtle shift that was hard to pinpoint but felt off. The second pass was unsettling. It made no logical sense for him to drive past the same camera an hour later, still heading inward. There was no turnaround point beyond that camera for many miles, only increasingly rough terrain. The discovery of the doubled camera pass intensified our concern. We had two distinct images of the same vehicle, an hour apart, both heading deeper into a restricted area. The dimmer headlights on the second pass were a detail that stuck with me. It suggested something was not right with the vehicle, or perhaps with its operator. The search teams were immediately redirected to focus on the area beyond the ridge camera. Ground crews, including RCMP officers and local volunteers, began a grid search. They followed the logging spur as far as it was passable, then continued on foot into the dense forest. The ground was wet clay, making progress slow and difficult. The cold was relentless, and a thin layer of frost covered everything. The last GPS ping, before the signal dropped completely, placed Deputy Miller's unit in a remote hollow. This hollow was known for its extreme isolation. There was no service road leading into it, only game trails and steep, overgrown slopes. It was a place where the forest truly closed in, a dark, silent pocket of wilderness. Searchers found no sign of the patrol unit on the spur itself, nor any tire tracks indicating a turnaround. The trail simply ended, swallowed by the undergrowth. The search continued for several days, expanding outward from the last known location. We deployed drones with thermal imaging, but the thick canopy made them largely ineffective. The radio remained silent. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the occasional static burst from a searcher's radio. Eventually, the search teams located Deputy Miller's patrol unit. It was found in the hollow, precisely where the last GPS ping had indicated. The vehicle was parked off a barely discernible game trail, partially obscured by dense brush. The engine was cold. The doors were locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no evidence of a crash. The interior was undisturbed. Deputy Miller's duty belt, his sidearm, and his radio were all present, neatly arranged on the passenger seat. His logbook was open on the dashboard, a few lines of his neat handwriting visible. There was no note, no message, nothing to explain his presence there, or his sudden disappearance. The fuel tank was nearly full. The headlights were off, but when tested, they functioned perfectly, shining with their full, bright intensity. The dimmer appearance on the second camera pass remained unexplained. The official report concluded with no definitive answers. Deputy Miller was listed as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness. The file remains open, but active searching ceased months ago. The incident was a stark reminder of the isolation inherent in our work, the vastness of the forest, and the suddenness with which someone can simply vanish. The GPS data, the camera photographs, and the undisturbed patrol unit all became pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The fact that his unit was seen twice, heading in the same direction, with dimmer lights the second time, still haunts the quiet corners of my mind. It suggests a deliberate, unsettling act, something beyond a simple lost patrol. I still think about that second pass on the ridge camera, the way the headlights seemed to dim, as if something was draining their power, or perhaps as if they were trying to hide. I was leading a volunteer search and rescue team that morning. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, cold edge in the deep forest. We were flagging a creek line, but the water sound grew louder as we climbed uphill. My team had been tasked with establishing a new flag line along a tributary known as Blackwater Creek. This was standard procedure for upcoming training exercises and potential future search operations. The creek ran through a section of dense, old-growth forest, eventually feeding into the larger Elk River. Our objective was to mark a path from the confluence upstream for about 3 miles, ensuring clear navigation for ground teams. We started near the river, where the creek was wide and shallow, its current steady. The morning sun was still low, casting long shadows through the pines and hemlocks. A thin layer of frost coated the fallen leaves and exposed rocks. The work was routine. We moved at a steady pace, one person navigating, another tying bright orange flagging tape to branches at regular intervals. The sound of the creek was a constant presence, a low gurgle and rush that typically diminished as one ascended. Water flows downhill, and the sound of a creek should naturally lessen as its volume and gradient decrease. This fundamental principle of topography was ingrained in every SAR member. We relied on these basic environmental cues to orient ourselves in the wilderness. The forest was quiet otherwise, save for the occasional bird call and the rustle of our gear. We had checked the weather report earlier. Clear skies, but temperatures would stay barely above freezing. We had been moving for about an hour, perhaps 1.5 miles upstream. The creek narrowed, and the gradient became steeper as expected. However, the sound of the water seemed to intensify rather than recede. I paused, listening intently. The rushing noise felt more immediate, more powerful than it should have been at this elevation. I checked my altimeter and GPS. We were indeed gaining altitude, steadily climbing the slope. My team leader, Mark, also noticed it. He pointed upstream, his expression a mix of confusion and mild curiosity. The creek sound was undeniably louder, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the damp earth. We continued, pushing through a particularly dense section of laurel. The thick, interwoven branches formed a natural tunnel, dimming the already muted light. Inside this tunnel, the sound of the creek became almost overwhelming. It was a roar, a sustained rush that echoed off the damp leaves and rock faces. The air felt colder, and the humidity inside the laurel tunnel was palpable. Water dripped from the overhead canopy, adding to the pervasive dampness. We communicated mostly through hand signals now, our voices swallowed by the insistent noise of the water. It was disorienting. The roar seemed to come from all directions, yet the creek itself, though swift, did not appear to be at flood stage. Its banks were well defined, and the water level seemed normal for late autumn. We emerged from the Laurel Tunnel into a small clearing, still following the creek. The sound persisted, a constant, thundering presence. I checked my instruments again. The altimeter confirmed we were several hundred feet higher than our starting point. The GPS showed our position deep within the designated creek line. There was no logical explanation for the amplified sound. A waterfall might explain it, but the topography showed no such feature upstream. The gradient was steep, but not precipitous. We continued to tie our flags, each knot a small act of defiance against the growing unease. The forest felt different here, quieter somehow, despite the overwhelming sound of the water. The usual rustling of small animals was absent. After another half hour, we decided to turn back. The anomaly of the sound was too pronounced to ignore. We had flagged a little over 2 miles. As we began our descent, the sound of the creek, counterintuitively, began to diminish. It was a gradual fading, matching our downward progress. The roar softened to a rush, then to a gurgle, until it returned to the expected volume for that section of the creek. The experience left a quiet, unsettling impression on the team. We discussed it briefly, but no one had a plausible explanation. We attributed it to an unusual acoustic phenomenon within the Laurel Tunnel, perhaps a unique combination of rock formations and dense foliage. The next day, I returned alone to retrieve the flagging tape. This was also standard procedure, ensuring no trace was left behind. The morning was clear and cold, a thin fog hanging low over the creek bed. I started at the confluence and began following the flag line upstream. The creek sounded normal, a gentle murmur as I walked. As I approached the section where the sound had been so intense the previous day, I noticed something else. The knots on the flagging tape were tied differently. I always tie a specific type of square knot, a habit developed over years of SAR work. These knots were not mine. They were tied left-handed, a mirror image of my usual method. I stopped, examining a few of the flags. Each knot was consistent, a left-handed version of my own. I am right-handed, and so is Mark, my team leader. No one else on our small team tied knots this way. I felt a cold prickle on my skin, unrelated to the morning air. I continued upstream, carefully removing each flag. Every single one was tied with the same left-handed knot. There were no signs of disturbance, no footprints other than our own from the previous day, no broken branches. The forest was still, the only sound the gentle flow of the creek. The isolation felt more profound now, a heavy presence in the quiet woods. I reached the point where we had turned back. The flags ended there. I took a photograph of the last flag, focusing on the knot. The evidence was clear. I then made my way back down, the retrieved flags bundled in my pack. The entire time, I listened intently to the creek, but its sound remained consistent with the topography. The loud hum from the previous day was absent. When I returned to the SAR cabin, I checked the stream gauge logbook. The gauge, located about a mile downstream from our starting point, recorded the creek's water level and flow rate. The log showed a consistent falling trend for the past few days, indicating lower water levels, not higher. This contradicted the perceived increase in sound even further. I reviewed our shift report from the previous day, noting the observation about the unusual creek sound. I also checked my phone. I had recorded a short audio clip near the Laurel Tunnel, intending to capture the ambient forest sounds for a training module. Playing it back, the recording was dominated by a deep, resonant roar, unmistakably the amplified sound of the creek. It was exactly as I remembered it, a powerful, disorienting noise. The static on the recording was minimal, indicating a clear capture of the environmental sound. There was no explanation for the left-handed knots, nor for the creek's sudden, localized amplification against a backdrop of falling water levels. I filed a detailed report, including the photograph of the knot and the discrepancy with the stream gauge log. The incident was noted as an unexplained environmental anomaly. There was no evidence of foul play, no missing persons, nothing to warrant further investigation by the RCMP. It simply remained an entry in the file, a procedural oddity. The team discussed it once more, but without resolution. We were trained to find answers, to bring order to chaos. But this event defied our understanding. It was a contradiction of fundamental principles, a brief, unsettling glimpse into something that did not fit. I still think about that creek sometimes, the sound of it growing louder uphill against all reason. I still hear that deep, resonant hum in the quiet moments, a whisper of something out of place. I was a Forest Service tech, patrolling the northern sector. It was late autumn, a little past midnight, and the air was cold. The first sign of trouble was the gate. My patrol route covered a vast stretch of protected forest land, a quiet expanse of pines and hardwoods. The main access road, a gravel track, was secured by a heavy steel gate about 3 miles in from the highway. This gate was a standard Forest Service issue, painted a dull green, secured with a thick chain and a robust padlock. My job often involved checking these access points, ensuring they remained closed to unauthorized vehicles. The isolation out here was profound, especially at night. The only sounds were the hum of my truck's engine and the rustle of leaves in the cold wind. I had been on this route for several years, and the routine was deeply ingrained. I knew every curve of the trail, every dip in the gravel. On that particular night, the fog had begun to roll in, a thick, damp blanket that muted the already dim glow of my headlights. The temperature was barely above freezing. As I approached the gate, I slowed the truck, preparing to stop and log its status. My headlights cut through the swirling mist, illuminating the familiar structure. That was when I saw it. The gate was closed, but something was wrong. The heavy steel bar was latched from the inside, the padlock hanging open on the chain. It was a detail that immediately registered as out of place. The latch mechanism was designed to be secured from the outside, preventing entry. To find it latched from the wrong side meant someone had entered, closed it behind them, and then secured it in a way that defied its purpose. My truck idled, its engine a low hum in the stillness. I killed the headlights and the engine, plunging the immediate area into near total darkness, save for the faint glow of the dashboard. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. I reached for my flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp path through the fog. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. The gravel crunched under my boots. I approached the gate cautiously, my senses heightened. The metal felt cold and damp to the touch. The padlock, a heavy brass unit, was indeed open, swinging slightly on its chain. The latch itself was a simple, robust design, meant to be secured with a pin from the outside. Someone had slid the pin through from the interior of the gate, effectively locking themselves in, or perhaps locking something else in. I checked the ground around the gate. The gravel was loose, but I could make out fresh tire tracks. They were distinct, heavy treads, not typical of a recreational vehicle. They indicated a larger, commercial-style vehicle. I pulled out my patrol notes and logged the anomaly, noting the exact position of the latch and the tire tracks. My next step was to check the trail cameras. We had several strategically placed along this stretch of the access road, designed to monitor traffic and prevent illegal dumping or poaching. One camera was positioned about 100 yards back from the gate, offering a clear view of any vehicle approaching or leaving. I retrieved the camera, a small, rugged unit, and took it back to my truck. The isolation of the forest pressed in on me as I worked, a quiet, unsettling presence. Back in the relative warmth of the cabin of my truck, I connected the camera to my portable viewer. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of still images and short video clips. I scrolled through the footage from the previous hours. Most of it was uneventful. Deer moving through the fog, a few small nocturnal animals. Then, about an hour past midnight, a vehicle appeared. It was a box truck, a plain white commercial model without any discernible markings. It approached the gate from the interior of the forest, moving slowly. The truck stopped just before the gate. I watched as the driver, a figure obscured by the low resolution in the fog, exited the vehicle. The figure moved to the gate, and in the grainy footage, I could see the latch being manipulated. The truck then turned around, a slow, deliberate maneuver in the narrow space. What struck me was the absence of brake lights as it turned. The vehicle simply glided, its rear lights dark. It then drove back down the gravel road, disappearing into the fog. The footage was unsettling. The lack of brake lights, the deliberate, almost silent turn, and the reversed latch. It all pointed to something beyond a simple, unauthorized entry. I reviewed the footage several times, trying to discern any further details. The truck's license plate was unreadable due to the fog and the camera's angle. The driver's face was completely obscured. I made a report to dispatch, relaying the details of the reversed latch and the suspicious vehicle. Dispatch advised me to secure the gate properly and await the arrival of the local RCMP detachment. The wait felt long. The cold outside pressed against the windows of my truck. The forest was silent again, but the silence now felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. The RCMP arrived about an hour later, their cruiser's headlights cutting through the lingering fog. Corporal Davies, a seasoned officer I had worked with before, stepped out, his breath pluming in the cold air. We exchanged brief greetings. I walked him through my findings, showing him the gate, the reversed latch, and the tire tracks. He examined the padlock and the chain, his expression grim. I then showed him the trail camera footage on my viewer. He watched the box truck's movements intently, particularly the dark rear lights and the precise turn. He agreed that the situation was highly unusual. We then decided to follow the tire tracks further down the gravel road, deeper into the forest. The tracks were clear in the damp gravel, leading away from the gate. We drove slowly, Davies in his cruiser, me in my Forest Service truck, our headlights piercing the fog. The road wound through dense forest, the trees looming like silent sentinels. We continued for about 2 miles before the tracks veered off the main gravel road onto a smaller, less maintained trail. This trail led to a small, secluded pull-off area, often used by hunters or hikers. As we approached, the fog seemed to thicken, making visibility difficult. The air felt colder here, a damp chill that seeped into my bones. At the pull-off, the tire tracks became even more distinct in the softer ground. The box truck had clearly stopped here for some time. We got out of our vehicles, flashlights sweeping the area. The ground was a mix of gravel and damp earth, with patches of mud near a small stream crossing. It was at the stream crossing, just before a cattle guard, that we found more evidence. There were footprints in the mud, 2 distinct sets. One set was larger, consistent with a man's work boots. The other set was smaller, likely a woman's. The footprints led from the edge of the pull-off towards the cattle guard. And then they stopped, abruptly. Beyond the last clear footprints, the mud was disturbed in a different way. It was smooth, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The surface of the mud was flattened, almost polished in places, with faint parallel lines running through it. It looked as though a large, flat object, perhaps a sheet of plywood or a heavy tarp, had been pulled across the ground, erasing any further foot impressions. The effect was chilling. It suggested a deliberate act, a methodical effort to obscure a trail. Corporal Davies took several photographs of the footprints in the smoothed mud, documenting every detail. We searched the immediate area thoroughly, our flashlights cutting through the fog, but found nothing else. No discarded items, no signs of a struggle, just the silent, smoothed earth. The isolation of the forest felt oppressive. The RCMP initiated a missing persons investigation based on the evidence. The tire tracks were measured and photographed, entered into a file. The trail camera footage was sent for analysis, though the low resolution offered little more than what we had already seen. The box truck remained unidentified. The footprints were cast, but without a known individual to match them to, they provided little immediate help. The official report noted the unusual circumstances of the gate and the smoothed mud. Patrols were increased in the area, but no further evidence ever surfaced. The case went cold, a quiet entry in the logbook of unsolved disappearances. The memory of that night still lingers. I still patrol that sector, still check that gate. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the forest is quiet, I think of those footprints stopping so suddenly, and the smooth, undisturbed mud beyond. The cold hum of the wind through the trees can sometimes sound like a whisper. I was a search and rescue team lead, working a late shift in the northern Rockies. The air was crisp, just above freezing, under a thin crescent moon. Our radio crackled with an unusual crossbleed from another team on the same mountain. My team, designated Alpha, was tracking a lost hiker along a series of switchbacks on the western slope. Team Bravo, operating parallel to us on what we believed was an adjacent ridge, was conducting a similar sweep. We communicated primarily through handheld radios, maintaining a clear channel for critical updates. The night was quiet, save for the crunch of gravel under our boots and the occasional hum of our equipment. This was standard procedure for a late autumn search, the kind that often stretched into the early hours before dawn. We had been out for several hours already, moving steadily through the dense forest. The isolation of the mountains at night was a familiar companion, a constant presence that sharpened the senses. Our headlights cut through the deep shadows, illuminating patches of frost on the undergrowth. The initial call came through our primary channel, a voice from Team Bravo. It was Mark, their lead, asking for a status update. I responded immediately, confirming our position and progress. A few minutes later, Mark called again, his voice sounding a little more strained. He asked if we had heard him the first time. I assured him we had, and that I had replied. There was a brief, confused pause on his end. He then stated that he had heard my voice, but it sounded distant, almost like a whisper, and he hadn't been sure if it was a direct reply or just static. We both dismissed it as a minor radio anomaly, common in the rugged terrain where signals bounced off rock faces. The fog had begun to roll in, a thin, cold mist that clung to the higher elevations. We continued our ascent, following the faint trail. The switchbacks were steep, carved into the shale slope, making each step a deliberate effort. Our GPS units confirmed our position, showing us steadily gaining elevation. About an hour later, the radio crackled again. This time, it was Mark's voice, clear but urgent. He called my name, asking if I was there. I picked up the mic, ready to respond, but before I could speak, I heard my own voice, distinct and clear, reply to him through the radio. It was my exact phrasing, my tone, my cadence, saying, "Go ahead, Mark, this is Alpha." I froze, the mic still in my hand. Mark then responded to that voice, not mine, confirming his position. I heard the entire exchange play out. A conversation between Mark and a recording of myself. My team members looked at me, their faces illuminated by the glow of their headlamps, confusion etched into their expressions. I finally keyed the mic. "Mark, this is Alpha. Did you just hear me reply to you?" There was a longer pause this time. Mark's voice came back, sounding genuinely rattled. "Yeah, I did. But it wasn't you, was it? It sounded like you, but it wasn't live." He explained that he had heard my voice, clear as day, respond to his initial call. But then he heard my voice again, a few seconds later, asking if he had heard me. It was a mirror of what I had just experienced. We were both hearing each other, but with a strange, consistent lag, and sometimes our own voices played back to us. We decided to halt our progress. The situation felt profoundly unsettling. We were both on the same mountain, supposedly on parallel switchbacks, yet our radio communications were behaving as if we were in some kind of time loop. Mark suggested we try to converge, to physically meet and sort out the radio issue. We agreed to head towards a prominent overlook, a wide, flat area about a mile above us. We continued to record all radio traffic and our own observations on handheld digital recorders, a standard part of our kit. The air grew colder as we climbed, the frost thickening on the branches. The crunch of shale underfoot was the only sound for long stretches. As we moved, the radio remained mostly silent, but the feeling of unease persisted. We reached the overlook about an hour later. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the vast, dark expanse of the forest below. We scanned the opposite slope with our powerful spotlights, expecting to see Mark's team approaching. There was nothing. No headlights, no movement. I called Mark on the radio. He answered, his voice sounding closer now. He said they were at the overlook, waiting for us. I looked around again, slowly turning, my light sweeping the entire area. We were alone. Mark insisted they were there, describing the exact same rock formations and the same view I was seeing. A chill, colder than the night air, settled over me. I asked Mark to describe his path to the overlook. He detailed the switchbacks, the shale, the specific landmarks. His description perfectly matched our route. I then asked him to check his GPS track. A few minutes later, his voice came back, laced with a new kind of dread. Their GPS showed they had followed the exact same path we had, but their track was moving in the opposite direction, as if they had started from the top and were descending, while we were ascending. We had both been on the same set of switchbacks, moving towards each other, yet we had never seen or heard each other directly. We decided to return to base immediately. The incident was beyond anything we had encountered. The RCMP dispatch was notified, and we made our way down the mountain, the silence on the radio now absolute. Back at the cabin, the two teams finally met. Mark's team looked as shaken as mine felt. We compared our GPS tracks. The data was undeniable. Two distinct tracks, perfectly overlaid, but moving in opposing directions on the same physical trail. It was as if we had occupied the same space at different times, or perhaps in different realities. The real evidence, however, came from the audio recordings. We had both recorded the entire incident. When we played them back, synchronized to the moment of the first mirror exchange, the effect was chilling. On my recorder, I heard Mark's voice call out, then my own voice, clear and live, respond. A few seconds later, Mark's voice would come back, confused. On Mark's recorder, the sequence was similar, but with a consistent offset. He heard my voice, then his own voice, clear and live, respond. The most disturbing detail was a distinct owl call, a deep hoot that appeared on both recordings. On my file, it was heard just before my mirror voice replied to Mark. On Mark's file, the exact same owl call, with the exact same tonal quality, was heard about 6 seconds later, just before his mirror voice replied to me. It was as if the sound itself had been recorded, then played back with a delay, triggering our own recorded voices. The RCMP opened a file. We submitted our equipment, the GPS data, and the audio files. The technical experts at the detachment spent weeks analyzing the evidence. They found no fault with our radios, no evidence of tampering, no known atmospheric conditions that could explain such a precise, time-delayed mirroring of audio and GPS tracks. The owl call was particularly baffling. It was identical on both recordings, down to the smallest frequency detail, but consistently offset by about 6 seconds. There was no logical explanation for how two teams, on the same trail, moving in opposite directions, could have heard each other's recorded voices and a delayed, identical owl call without ever physically encountering each other. The official report eventually concluded with unexplained radio interference and GPS anomaly. The file was closed, but no one involved truly accepted that explanation. We were experienced professionals, accustomed to the quirks of mountain operations. This was different. It felt like a fundamental distortion of reality, a brief, terrifying glimpse into something that simply should not be possible. The incident left a deep impression on both teams. We continued our work, but the quiet dread of that night never fully dissipated. Sometimes, when I am alone in the forest at night, the air cold and still, I hear it. It is not the wind or the rustle of leaves. It is the faint, distant hoot of an owl, a sound that seems to carry a strange, unsettling echo. I was a state park ranger, patrolling the northern sector of the preserve. It was a late autumn night, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had settled across the higher elevations. My radio crackled with a burst of static, more pronounced than usual, even for that remote area. My shift had begun just after sunset, a routine patrol of the park's perimeter and access points. The park spanned a vast area, mostly dense forest and rugged terrain, with a few maintained trails and a single paved highway cutting through its lower reaches. The northern sector, where I spent most of my time, was particularly isolated. It bordered a wilderness area, and human activity was minimal, especially after the tourist season ended. My duties involved checking trailheads, ensuring gates were secured, and responding to any unusual activity. Most nights were quiet, marked only by the hum of my patrol vehicle's engine and the occasional rustle of unseen wildlife. The park's rules were clear, especially concerning the restricted zones. One such zone, the old logging trail known as Blackwood Ridge, had been closed for years due to erosion and sensitive ecological restoration efforts. A heavy chain and padlock secured its access point, a deterrent that had proven effective for a long time. I knew that trail well, having hiked it many times before its closure. It wound deep into a particularly dense part of the forest, eventually leading to a high overlook that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Tonight, the fog made even the nearest trees appear as indistinct shapes. The cold seeped into the cabin of my truck, despite the heater running steadily. I was driving slowly along the main access road, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the dense fog. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. My radio had been mostly silent since that initial burst of static, a low hum now the only sound from it. I was approaching the turnoff for Blackwood Ridge, a section I always checked, even though it was closed. The chain across the entrance was a familiar sight, a heavy-gauge link secured with a robust padlock. It had not been disturbed in years. As I rounded a gentle curve, a faint glow appeared ahead, diffused by the fog. It was not the steady amber light of a distant cabin or a passing vehicle on the highway. This light was sharper, whiter, and seemed to flicker with a subtle rhythm. My first thought was a hunter, perhaps lost, but hunting season was over, and this area was strictly off-limits. I slowed the truck, my gaze fixed on the anomaly. The glow intensified, resolving into distinct points of light. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, through the fog. I pulled the patrol truck to the shoulder, killed the engine, and rolled down the window. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant whisper of the wind through the forest canopy. The cold air rushed in, carrying the dampness of the fog. The lights were clearer now, a procession of what looked like headlamps moving in a single file. They were on the Blackwood Ridge Trail, well past the chained access point, deep inside the closed section. I counted them carefully, my breath misting in the frigid air. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There were exactly 11 distinct points of light, each a small bright orb in the swirling gray. They maintained a steady, slow pace, moving deeper into the trail, away from the main road. The fog was so thick that the light seemed to be swallowed almost immediately after each point. There was no sound accompanying them, no crunch of gravel, no rustle of clothing, no voices. Just the silent, methodical advance of the 11 lights. My hand instinctively went to the radio, but I hesitated. Reporting 11 phantom headlamps moving silently through a closed trail in dense fog felt absurd, even to me. I watched, my eyes straining, trying to discern any shape or form behind the lights. There was nothing, only the pure, unadulterated glow. They continued their slow march for what felt like several minutes, each light a small, defiant beacon against the overwhelming gray. Then, as if on an unspoken signal, the first light dimmed, then vanished. The next followed, and the next, in perfect sequence, until all 11 had disappeared into the impenetrable fog. The trail was dark once more, the silence even heavier than before. I sat there for a long moment, the cold seeping into my bones, trying to process what I had just witnessed. My mind searched for a rational explanation, a trick of the light, a reflection, an optical illusion caused by the fog. But the distinct count, the steady movement, the sequential disappearance, it defied any easy answer. I started the truck, the engine roaring to life, breaking the oppressive silence. My first priority was to check the chained access point. I drove the short distance to the Blackwood Ridge turnoff, my headlights illuminating the familiar barrier. The heavy chain was still in place, the padlock secured. It looked undisturbed. I got out, flashlight in hand, and approached the gate. The air here was even colder, and a thin layer of frost had begun to form on the metal. I ran my gloved hand along the chain, checking for any signs of tampering. It felt solid, unyielding. But as my beam swept over the lowest link, something caught my eye. A smear of dark, wet clay clung to the bottom of the chain, just above the gravel. It was fresh, distinct against the rusted metal. The ground around the chain was mostly dry gravel, but a small, muddy patch existed just beyond the gate, where a seasonal spring often overflowed. This clay was from that specific patch. I knelt, examining it closely. There were no clear boot prints in the gravel, but the clay on the chain suggested something had been dragged over it, or perhaps someone had stepped over it, brushing against the metal. The padlock itself remained intact, showing no signs of forced entry. I spent the next hour meticulously searching the area around the gate. I walked a short distance down the closed trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, looking for any tracks or discarded items. The ground was soft in places, but the fog made visibility difficult, and I found nothing conclusive. The silence of the forest pressed in on me, amplifying every snap of a twig underfoot. I returned to the patrol truck, my mind racing. The fresh clay on the chain was undeniable evidence that someone, or something, had accessed the closed trail. But how? And why? And what about the 11 lights? I knew I had to file a report. As I was about to get back into the truck, my flashlight beam caught a small, folded object lying near the base of a pine tree, just a few feet from the chained gate. It was a paper map, a standard Park Service topographical map, but it was folded incorrectly. Instead of showing the Blackwood Ridge area, it was creased to display a completely different quadrant of the park, one far to the south, near the main highway. The map was slightly damp from the fog, but otherwise undamaged. There were no markings on it, no notes, no names. It was just a map, folded to the wrong section, left behind in a place it did not belong. I carefully picked it up, noting its condition. This was physical evidence, something tangible to add to my report. I radioed dispatch, keeping my voice calm and factual. I reported unauthorized access to the Blackwood Ridge Trail, citing the fresh clay on the chain and the discarded map. I omitted any mention of the 11 lights. That detail felt too strange, too unquantifiable to include in an official logbook entry. The next morning, under a pale gray sky, I returned to the Blackwood Ridge Trail with a supervisor. The fog had lifted, revealing a landscape still damp and cold. We photographed the chain and the clay smear. The map was bagged as evidence. My supervisor, a seasoned ranger named Miller, examined the scene with a practiced eye. He noted the lack of clear footprints and the intact padlock. He agreed that the clay was fresh, indicating recent activity. We walked a short distance down the trail, but the ground was mostly hard-packed earth and gravel, offering no further clues. The incident was logged as a minor trespass, with the map and a photograph of the chain filed in the park's evidence locker. The RCMP were notified, as is standard procedure for any potential unauthorized activity in a protected area, but without further evidence, their involvement would be minimal. I completed my detailed report, focusing on the physical evidence and my observations of the disturbed chain. I still did not include the lights. It felt like a detail that would undermine the credibility of the rest of my account. The chain was resecured, though it had never truly been breached. The map remained a mystery, its incorrect folding offering no logical explanation for its presence. The official file on the Blackwood Ridge incident remains open, though inactive. The map is still in the evidence locker, a silent, folded piece of paper. I still patrol that sector of the park, especially on foggy nights. Sometimes, when the conditions are just right, I find myself slowing down as I approach the Blackwood Ridge turnoff. I listen for the whisper of the wind, and I watch the fog, half expecting to see those 11 silent lights reappear, moving in their slow, deliberate procession into the dark forest. I was working a routine patrol with my partner, checking remote trail markers. It was late autumn, the air crisp and clear, the sun low over the eastern ridges. A faint, unusual hum began to register on our handheld radio, barely audible over the forest sounds. My name is Mark, and I have spent years in the backcountry, mostly in the northern reaches of the Appalachian range. My partner, David, had similar experience, a quiet man with an instinct for the terrain. Our job involved maintaining communication relays, checking emergency caches, and logging trail conditions across a vast, isolated wilderness. We were accustomed to long days, sudden weather shifts, and the profound silence of the deep forest. Our equipment was always meticulously checked. Satellite phones, a robust first aid kit, a portable weather station, and two-way radios. We kept a detailed logbook of everything we encountered, from animal tracks to unusual atmospheric readings. This particular day had started like many others, with a cold, clear morning and the promise of a long, uneventful trek. We had planned a traverse of the Blackwood Ridge, a narrow, exposed spine known for its challenging conditions. We were nearing the highest point of the ridge, a section where the trail narrowed to little more than a goat path. The ground was loose shale, and the drop-offs on either side were steep, covered in a dense scrub of stunted pines and gnarled hemlocks. The air had been still, almost unnaturally so, for the past hour. Then, without warning, the wind hit us. It was not a gust, but a solid, physical shove, coming from the west, directly across the ridge spine. The force was immense, pushing us sideways, our boots scraping for purchase on the loose rock. I felt my pack shift violently, threatening to throw me off balance. David, a few paces ahead, stumbled hard, his arm flailing as he fought to stay upright. We both instinctively dropped to our knees, pressing ourselves against the rocky ground. The wind roared, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very rock beneath us. It was unlike any wind I had ever experienced in the mountains. This was not just strong, it felt dense, almost liquid, as if the air itself had solidified and was trying to peel us from the ridge. Small stones and dry leaves whipped past, stinging our faces. I could hear the branches of the scrub pines snapping, a sharp, cracking sound swallowed by the overall roar. My eyes were squeezed shut against the debris, but I could feel the sudden, inexplicable heat on my exposed skin. It was a dry, oppressive warmth, completely at odds with the cold, clear morning we had started with. I glanced at the portable barometer clipped to my pack strap. The needle was dropping rapidly, a visible plummet that defied logic for such a sudden, localized event. We stayed low for what felt like several minutes, the wind a relentless, physical presence. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it eased, though a strong, steady breeze remained. We slowly pushed ourselves up, our muscles trembling from the effort. David was pale, his eyes wide. He checked his pack, then patted his hip where his handheld radio usually sat. His face tightened. The radio was gone. We scanned the immediate area, but the ground was bare rock, and the drop-off was steep. The wind had been strong enough to rip it clean off his belt. We knew the risks of losing communication in such remote terrain. The air still felt strangely warm, a lingering heat that made the cold metal of my own radio feel cool against my palm. We decided to descend slightly, seeking shelter in a small stand of dead hemlocks a little below the ridgeline. The trees were skeletal, stripped of bark, their branches brittle and gray. They stood like silent sentinels, victims of some past blight or drought. As we moved cautiously down the slope, the ground still felt unstable underfoot. We heard a deep, groaning crack, a sound that resonated through the forest. A massive dead hemlock, One of the largest in the stand began to lean, slowly at first, then accelerated, crashing down with a thunderous impact. The ground shook. Dust and splintered wood exploded into the air. The tree fell across the very path we had intended to take, blocking our way. We paused, catching our breath, the sound of the falling tree still echoing in the sudden quiet. The air was thick with the smell of dry wood and pine needles. The wind had died down to a whisper, but the heat remained, a palpable presence. We had to navigate around the fallen giant. As we approached the tangle of branches and trunk, David stopped abruptly. He pointed. Wedged beneath a thick, splintered limb, half buried in the disturbed earth, was his missing radio. It was a small, dark rectangle, surprisingly intact. We carefully pulled it free. The casing was scratched, but the battery indicator showed a full charge. There was no logical way it could have landed there. The wind had pushed us sideways, not forward, and the tree had fallen after the radio was lost. We checked the radio. It powered on immediately, but instead of the usual clear channel, there was only static. A low, persistent hum permeated the signal, a sound I recognized from interference, but this was different. It felt deeper, more resonant. We tried to make contact with dispatch, but received no reply, only the unwavering hum beneath the static. The isolation of the forest pressed in on us. We took a photograph of the fallen tree and the recovered radio, noting the exact location in our field notes. The incident felt profoundly unsettling. The barometer on my pack now showed a slight rise, but the temperature remained elevated, a dry, unnatural warmth that clung to the air. We continued our patrol, the recovered radio now secured in David's pack, but the hum persisted whenever we powered it on. The rest of the day passed without further incident, but the memory of that wind, that sudden heat, and the inexplicable appearance of the radio under the fallen tree stayed with us. We completed our logbook entries that evening at a remote cabin, detailing the unusual weather phenomena and the lost and found radio. The report was factual, procedural, devoid of any personal speculation. We simply recorded the observations. Upon our return to base, we filed a full report. The weather log from the nearest station showed no record of extreme wind shear or sudden temperature spikes in our area for that day. The official explanation attributed the wind to a localized microburst, a rare but plausible event. The temperature anomaly was dismissed as a possible instrument error or a misreading. The radio's recovery was logged as a fortunate coincidence, perhaps dislodged by the falling tree itself, despite our clear recollection of the sequence of events. The hum on the radio was attributed to a faulty antenna or atmospheric interference. The file was closed. I still think about that day on the ridge, the feeling of that wind, the way it pushed us, the sudden heat, and the sound of that hemlock coming down. I sometimes hear that low, persistent hum in the back of my mind, a quiet whisper from the deep forest. I work as a trail maintainer for the Regional Park Service. It was late autumn, the air crisp and carrying the scent of damp leaves. I noticed the first cairn was not quite right. My route that day covered the northern section of the Blackwood Ridge Trail, a stretch I knew well. This particular trail ran through a remote forest, winding over a few saddles and through a deep gap. My job involved clearing fallen branches, checking trail markers, and ensuring the paths remained safe for hikers. I carried a pack with basic tools, a radio for dispatch, and a small camera for documentation. The work was solitary, often quiet, and I found a certain peace in the isolation. I had been doing this for several years, and the rhythm of the forest was familiar to me. The weather had been clear for a few days, though a cold front was expected by nightfall. The first cairn stood at the top of the gap, marking a turn where the trail became less distinct. It was a simple stack of rocks, topped with a distinctive piece of white quartz. My records indicated it had been tampered with a few weeks prior, scattered by what looked like animal activity or perhaps a careless hiker. My task was to rebuild it. I spent about an hour carefully restacking the stones, ensuring the quartz sat firmly on top. I took a photograph of the completed cairn, noting the time and date in my logbook. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. I moved on, planning to check the shelter spur a little further down the trail before heading back to the cabin. The air grew colder as dusk settled, and a thin fog began to drift through the lower sections of the forest. I reached the shelter spur, a short side trail leading to a small, rustic lean-to. My routine included checking the shelter's condition and the register book kept inside. The shelter was empty, as expected, and in good order. I opened the register, a worn, spiral-bound notebook, and flipped through the recent entries. Most were from a few weeks ago, standard hiker notes about conditions or wildlife sightings. I signed my own entry, noting the trail conditions and the time, then closed the book and secured it in its plastic bag. I continued along the main trail, the light fading quickly. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could feel the frost beginning to form on the damp leaves underfoot. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the deepening gloom. I had planned to be back at the truck before full dark, but the cairn rebuild had taken longer than anticipated. I decided to push on, knowing the path back to the highway was mostly downhill. The forest became a different place at night, the familiar shapes of trees turning into indistinct masses. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of unseen animals. I was about a mile past the shelter spur when I realized I had left my spare headlamp battery at the cairn site. It was a minor oversight, but one I preferred to correct immediately, given the increasing cold and the distance back to the truck. I turned around, retracing my steps. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the trees, making the trail seem unfamiliar. The air felt sharper, biting at my exposed skin. I moved at a steady pace, my breath pluming in the cold night air. The beam of my headlamp struggled to penetrate the dense fog, creating a sense of tunnel vision. When I reached the gap, the fog was particularly heavy. I approached the cairn, expecting to retrieve the battery from where I had set it down earlier. My headlamp beam swept across the spot. The cairn was standing. Not just standing, but perfectly rebuilt, exactly as I had left it hours earlier. The distinctive piece of white quartz was still on top. I stopped, my boots crunching on the gravel. This was impossible. I had rebuilt it myself, then walked away. No one else had been on the trail since. I moved closer, my headlamp beam fixed on the stack of stones. It was identical. The same arrangement, the same quartz. I knelt, examining the base. The ground around it was soft from the recent dampness. There were boot prints. They circled the cairn, a clear perimeter, but none entered the immediate space where the stones stood. The prints were distinct, a heavy lug sole, but they did not match my own. They were also fresh, pressed into the damp earth. I took out my phone and photographed the cairn again, then the boot prints. The cold was seeping into my bones, but a different kind of chill had settled over me. I checked my logbook, confirming the time I had rebuilt the cairn. It had been late afternoon. Now it was well past midnight. The idea that someone had followed me, waited for me to leave, then rebuilt the cairn in the exact same way without disturbing the ground around it, felt absurd. The boot prints circling without entry were the most unsettling detail. It suggested an observation, a deliberate act, but one that defied logic. I stood there for a few minutes, the silence of the forest pressing in, broken only by the faint hum of my headlamp. I decided to continue my return journey, but the incident had changed my focus. I needed to re-examine the shelter logbook. The thought had occurred to me that if someone was on the trail, they might have signed in. I pushed through the fog, moving faster than before, a sense of urgency guiding my steps. The cold was intense, and I could feel the frost coating the branches around me. The trail felt longer, the trees more menacing in the low light. My radio was silent, only static when I tried to check in with dispatch. I reached the shelter spur again, my heart pounding. I pulled out the register book, my fingers stiff with cold. I flipped back to the entries from the previous year, scanning for anything unusual. And then I saw it. A name, scrawled in a familiar hand. It was a name I recognized from an old incident report, a hiker who had been reported missing in the area about a year ago. The entry was dated for the previous autumn, but the handwriting was identical to an entry I had seen just hours earlier, from a few weeks ago. The date of the recent entry was also the same as the current date, but from the previous year. It was as if the same person had signed the book twice, a year apart, on the same calendar day. I took a photograph of both entries, the older one and the more recent one, side by side. The ink had faded slightly on the older entry, but the distinctive loops and angles of the signature were unmistakable. The name was common enough, but the circumstances were not. A missing person, a year ago, and now their signature appearing in the logbook, dated for today, but from the past. It was a disorienting discovery, a break in the normal order of things. The cold seemed to deepen, and the isolation of the forest felt absolute. I secured the logbook and made my way back to the main trail. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the faint outline of the trees against a sky that was just starting to lighten with the approach of dawn. I walked quickly, my mind racing, trying to process what I had seen. The rebuilt cairn, the circling boot prints, the logbook entry. Each piece was unsettling on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made no sense. I reached my truck as the first light broke through the eastern sky. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the vehicle. Back at the ranger station, I filed a detailed report. I included the photographs of the cairn and the logbook entries. My supervisor listened calmly, reviewing the evidence. He noted the unusual nature of the incident, but offered no immediate explanation. The official response was to open a file, documenting the strange occurrences. The RCMP were notified, and a brief investigation was conducted. They found no further evidence, no other boot prints, and no sign of anyone having been on the trail. The logbook was taken as evidence, and the entries were analyzed. The handwriting was confirmed to be consistent across both entries, but the discrepancy in dates remained unexplained. I was advised to avoid that section of the trail for a while. The incident was logged as an unexplained occurrence, a curious footnote in the park's records. I continued my work on other trails, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The feeling of being watched, the impossible rebuilding of the cairn, the name in the logbook, it all lingered. It was a quiet dread, a sense that something had shifted in the familiar world, something that defied explanation. I still think about that name in the logbook sometimes. I wonder about the boot prints that circled without entry, and the quartz on top of the cairn. The forest holds its secrets, and some of them are not meant to be understood. I was on night patrol with my partner in the park. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp chill, with a thin layer of frost on the ground. We noticed a new mile marker along a paved road, one that was not on our route sheet. My partner was driving the patrol vehicle that night. We were making our usual rounds through the northern sector of the park. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar asphalt and the dense forest on either side. We had just passed the turnoff for the old fire watch cabin, a route we knew intimately. That's when the marker appeared. It was a standard green sign, white lettering, indicating a milepost number. The number itself was not unusual, but its presence on that specific stretch of road was. This particular road, the Spruce Ridge Parkway, had its mile markers cataloged in our duty log and on every map sheet. This one was entirely new, an unlisted waypoint. My partner slowed the vehicle. We both looked at it, then at each other. The sign seemed professionally installed, not vandalized or crudely placed. It simply existed where it should not have. Our routine patrols were usually uneventful. We covered a vast, isolated territory, mostly forest and winding roads.
The park was quiet at night, especially after the tourist season ended. Our job involved checking campgrounds, securing gates, and responding to occasional calls from remote cabins. We knew the sounds of the forest, the way the wind whispered through the pines, the distant howl of a coyote. The radio static was a constant companion, a low hiss that occasionally broke with dispatch calls. We relied on our maps, our handheld GPS units, and years of accumulated knowledge about the terrain. Every trail, every overlook, every service road was documented. Any deviation from this known environment was immediately flagged. We were the eyes and ears of the park in the dark hours, maintaining order in a wild, sprawling space. Our training emphasized observation and strict adherence to protocol. My partner pulled the vehicle to the shoulder. I stepped out into the cold night air. The frost crunched under my boots. I walked over to the milepost. It was a standard issue sign, about 3 feet tall, set into the ground with a sturdy metal post. The number displayed was a single digit, a number that did not correspond to any known sequence on the Spruce Ridge Parkway. I checked my handheld GPS unit. The device showed our current location, confirming we were indeed on the parkway, but it offered no data regarding this specific marker. It was a ghost entry. I took a photograph of the sign with my duty camera. My partner joined me, shining a powerful flashlight beam on the sign. He consulted his own map sheet, tracing the route with a gloved finger. There was nothing. We radioed dispatch, reporting an uncatalogued mile marker. Dispatch confirmed their records showed no such marker on that road. They advised us to investigate its origin if it seemed safe to do so. The milepost indicated a turnoff just ahead, a small, unpaved track leading deeper into the forest. This track was also not on our maps. It was barely wide enough for our vehicle. The sign pointed directly to it. We decided to follow it, proceeding slowly. The ground beneath our tires changed from asphalt to hard-packed gravel, then to a rougher dirt trail. The headlights struggled to penetrate the dense canopy overhead. The air grew colder as we descended slightly. The trail was winding, and the forest pressed in close on both sides. We drove for what felt like about a mile, maybe a little more. The trail eventually opened into a small, circular clearing. This was an overlook, but not one listed in any park brochure or on any official map.
The paved surface of the overlook was new, the asphalt dark and fresh. It ended abruptly at a sheer-cut bank. The cut bank dropped away sharply, revealing raw, exposed clay. The smell of damp earth and minerals was strong in the air. From below the cut, a low, rhythmic hum emanated. It was an industrial sound, deep and constant,
like a large generator running. The sound was muffled by the earth, but clearly audible. It was not the sound of any natural phenomenon, nor any authorized park equipment. We killed the engine and sat in silence for a few moments, listening. The hum was steady, a mechanical pulse beneath the ground. My partner and I exchanged a look. This was far beyond an unlisted mile marker. This was an unauthorized construction, hidden and active. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, moving cautiously towards the edge of the overlook. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the sheer drop. There was no visible structure below, only the dark, wet clay face. The hum seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. We decided against descending into the cut. The situation felt too irregular, too deliberate in its concealment.
We were not equipped for a full-scale site investigation. Our role was observation and reporting. I took more photographs of the overlook, the fresh asphalt, the cut bank, and the general area. My partner marked the precise coordinates on his GPS. We noted the distinct smell of clay and the pervasive, low hum. We then backed the vehicle out of the overlook, carefully navigating the narrow dirt trail. The milepost still stood at the entrance to the unlisted track, a silent, misleading guide. We drove back to the main parkway and found a secure spot to make a more detailed report to dispatch. We described the unlisted road, the hidden overlook, and the industrial hum coming from below the ground. Dispatch acknowledged the report and advised us to return to our regular patrol route, stating that a specialized team would be sent to investigate the site in the morning. The rest of our shift passed without further incident, but the memory of the hum lingered. We completed our duty log, detailing every observation, every photograph taken, every coordinate recorded. The report was filed, marked for priority investigation. The next morning, a team from the regional office, accompanied by RCMP officers, was dispatched to the location. We were not part of that follow-up. Our involvement ended with the initial discovery and report. The official file on the incident was classified. We never received a full debriefing on what was found, or if anything was found at all. The milepost was removed, and the entrance to the dirt track was barricaded within a few days. The asphalt at the overlook was torn up, and the cut bank was filled in, returning the area to its natural state. It was as if the entire event had been erased. I still think about that hum sometimes. It was a sound that didn't belong, a mechanical whisper in the heart of the forest. The isolation of that hidden overlook, the raw clay, and the steady, deep vibration beneath the earth, it all remains. I still hear it sometimes, a low, distant thrum, when the night is particularly quiet. I operate drones for search and rescue operations in the Northern Territories. It was a cold, clear night in late autumn, just before the first heavy frost. My thermal imager picked up an unusual signature deep in a laurel thicket. The call came in just after midnight, a routine search for a missing hiker. The individual had been reported overdue from a day trip into the foothills, an area known for its dense forest and sudden temperature drops. I launched the drone from a small clearing near the main fire road, the rotors cutting through the crisp air. The machine climbed steadily, its navigation lights blinking against the dark canopy. I settled into the familiar hum of the controls, my eyes fixed on the display. My job involves hours of scanning, looking for any deviation from the natural thermal landscape. Most nights are uneventful, a steady sweep over cold rock and colder trees. The FLIR camera is sensitive, capable of distinguishing a deer from a human at a considerable distance. It filters out the ambient cold,
highlighting any warmth with a distinct, bright signature. This particular night, the air was still, and the ground was already firming up with the early stages of frost. The isolation of the forest was absolute, broken only by the distant whisper of the highway.
About 20 minutes into the flight, the thermal imager registered a clear hit. It was a stationary, human-sized heat signature, nestled deep within a particularly dense laurel pocket. The signature was strong, indicating a living body, and it remained perfectly still. I marked the coordinates and relayed them to dispatch. A ground team was already on standby, and they began their approach immediately. The protocol was clear. Maintain visual contact with the drone, guide the team in, and confirm the subject's status. The ground team, consisting of 2 experienced responders, began their trek from the fire road. I kept the drone hovering directly over the thermal signature, a bright beacon on my screen. The air temperature was barely above freezing, and the ground was slick with damp leaves. The forest floor was uneven, a mix of exposed roots and loose gravel. The radio crackled with their progress, their voices calm and professional. They were moving through thick underbrush, the laurel branches forming a dense, almost impenetrable wall. As they drew closer, I noticed a subtle change on the thermal display. The signature, while still present, seemed to waver slightly, almost as if it were flickering. I dismissed it as an artifact of the drone's movement, or perhaps a slight shift in the subject's position. The ground team reported reaching the edge of the laurel thicket, their headlamps cutting through the deep shadows. They confirmed the dense nature of the vegetation, describing it as a natural shelter. Then, the signature vanished. One moment it was there, a clear, bright shape. The next, it was gone. The screen reverted to the uniform blues and greens of the cold forest floor. I called out to the ground team, informing them of the sudden disappearance. There was a moment of static on the radio, then a voice confirmed they were just feet from the last known position. They pushed through the final barrier of laurel branches, their boots crunching on the dry leaves. The ground team reached the exact spot where the thermal signature had been. Their headlamps illuminated a small, circular clearing within the thicket. There was no one there. They reported finding a reflective emergency blanket crumpled on the ground. One of the responders knelt and touched it. He reported that it was distinctly warm to the touch, almost hot, as if someone had just been wrapped in it. This was a significant detail. The air was cold, and the ground was colder. A blanket left out would quickly lose any residual warmth. They spread out, searching the immediate vicinity. The ground was soft in places, damp earth beneath the leaf litter. One of the responders quickly located a fresh set of boot prints leading away from the blanket. The prints were distinct, showing a clear tread pattern, and they were recent. They led directly towards a small culvert that ran beneath the fire road, a short distance from the thicket. The culvert was a standard drainage pipe, made of corrugated metal, barely wide enough for a large animal. The ground team followed the boot prints to the mouth of the culvert. The prints stopped abruptly at the opening. The culvert itself was dark, and a faint metallic smell hung in the air. Water dripped steadily from the pipe's interior, echoing in the quiet night. The responders shined their lights inside. The pipe was too narrow for a human to crawl through, certainly not an adult. They confirmed this over the radio, their voices now tinged with a different kind of caution. The prints ended, and there was no sign of anyone entering or exiting the other side of the culvert. I brought the drone lower, sweeping the area with both thermal and optical cameras. There were no other tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no sign of anyone having moved away from the culvert or the laurel thicket. It was as if the person had simply ceased to exist at the culvert's entrance. The warm blanket, the fresh boot prints, and the impossible culvert entrance created a stark, unsettling contradiction.
The initial thermal hit, I realized, had been a decoy. The ground team spent another hour meticulously searching the area, expanding their perimeter. They photographed the blanket, the boot prints, and the culvert entrance. Every detail was logged. They noted the unusual warmth of the blanket, which persisted for several minutes after discovery. They also noted the complete absence of any other human activity in the vicinity. The forest remained silent, the only sounds the dripping water and the distant hum of my drone. The incident was officially logged as an unexplained occurrence. The reflective blanket was collected as evidence, though it offered no further clues. The boot prints were documented, but without a subject, they led nowhere. My FLIR stills showed the clear thermal signature, then its abrupt disappearance. The responder photographs confirmed the scene on the ground. The report detailed the sequence of events, emphasizing the contradictory nature of the findings. There was no logical explanation for the warm, empty blanket or the boot prints leading to an impassable culvert. The file remains open, categorized under unusual incidents. I still review the FLIR footage sometimes, watching that bright, steady signature flicker and then vanish. The memory of the warm foil found in the cold night and the dripping culvert that offered no answers stays with me. It was a calculated act, designed to draw attention, to lead us to a specific point, and then to disappear without a trace. The quiet dread comes from the implication of something intelligent and unseen, moving through the forest, leaving behind only questions. I still hear the low hum of the drone sometimes, even when I am not flying. It is a quiet sound, a reminder of that night. The cold air, the deep shadows, and the impossible vanishing act. I was the night dispatcher for a rural county, monitoring radio traffic and phone lines. It was a late autumn night, the air outside barely above freezing, a thin frost already forming on the windows. Then, a sound came through the open radio channel that should not have existed in our jurisdiction. My shift had started like any other. The dispatch center was a small, quiet room, lit by the soft glow of monitors and the occasional flash of a radio indicator. I had been working this post for over a decade, accustomed to the predictable rhythm of our county. Most calls involved minor traffic incidents, lost hikers, or the occasional domestic dispute. We covered a wide area, much of it dense forest and isolated stretches of highway, but our infrastructure was well documented. There were no active rail lines within our county limits, nor had there been for many decades. The last tracks were pulled up sometime in the middle of the previous century. The sound was faint at first, a low, drawn-out hum that seemed to vibrate through the console itself. It was not static, nor was it the usual crackle of a distant transmission. I leaned closer, adjusting the squelch on the primary channel. The hum resolved into something more distinct, a deep, resonant tone that swelled and then faded. It was unmistakably the sound of a locomotive whistle, a long, mournful blast, the kind that carries for miles across open country. I checked the active channels, but no units were transmitting. The sound seemed to emanate from the radio itself, a phantom signal bleeding through. I logged the anomaly, noting the time and the unusual nature of the audio. About a minute later, a new alert flashed on my screen. It was a cell ping, a routine automated notification indicating a call had been placed from a specific sector. This was not unusual, but the location was. The ping originated from an area known locally as the Blackwood Preserve, a vast tract of privately owned forest, clearly marked with no trespassing signs and barbed wire. It was rugged land, rarely accessed, even by hunters.
The ping placed the caller roughly half a mile inside the posted boundary, deep within the woods. I tried to raise the number, but it went straight to voicemail. There was no emergency call associated with the ping, just the automated system registering a brief connection. The timing felt too coincidental, coming so soon after the phantom whistle. I reviewed the map overlay, confirming the precise location within the preserve. It was a remote spot, far from any established trail or logging road.
The nearest highway was several miles away, a winding 2-lane road that saw little traffic after nightfall. The air in the dispatch room felt colder, despite the steady hum of the equipment. I decided to send a patrol. Deputy Miller and Deputy Chen were on duty, patrolling the northern sector, not far from the preserve. I relayed the details, the anomalous whistle, the stray cell ping, and the precise location within the posted land. I emphasized the lack of an actual emergency call, framing it as a welfare check on a potential trespasser. They acknowledged the call, their voices calm and professional over the radio. I heard the faint hum of their patrol car's engine as they began their drive toward the preserve. The night was dark, with a thick fog beginning to roll in, obscuring the distant headlights of passing vehicles on the highway. The deputies arrived at the nearest access point to the Blackwood Preserve about 20 minutes later. Deputy Miller reported their position, confirming the no trespassing signs were intact. They would proceed on foot, following the approximate vector of the cell ping. I watched their progress on the digital map, a small icon moving slowly through the dense green of the forest. The radio remained quiet, save for the occasional burst of static as they moved deeper into the tree line. The isolation of their position was palpable, even from my warm, lit dispatch center. After about an hour, Deputy Miller reported they had reached the general area of the ping. The terrain was difficult, he explained, thick with underbrush and fallen timber. They found no sign of a person, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed leaves. The air was still and cold, he noted, with a heavy scent of damp earth and pine needles. They swept the area for another 15 minutes, calling out periodically, but received no response. There was no cabin, no makeshift shelter, nothing to indicate anyone had been there recently. Then, Deputy Chen called in. He had found something unusual. It was a faint scar on the landscape, a long, narrow depression running down a steep slope. It looked like an old cut, overgrown with briars and saplings, but still discernible. He described it as a shallow trench, about the width of a small vehicle, leading down towards what appeared to be an old roadbed. The roadbed itself was barely visible, swallowed by decades of forest growth, but its outline was clear enough. It ran parallel to the direction the cell ping had indicated. Deputy Miller joined him, confirming the observation. They followed the faint trail of the old roadbed for a short distance. It was choked with thick briars, making progress slow and difficult. The ground underfoot was soft, a mix of damp soil and decaying leaves. They found no evidence of recent passage, no broken branches, no fresh tracks. The roadbed simply ended abruptly, dissolving into an impenetrable wall of thorny bushes and dense forest. There was no sign of any rail infrastructure, no ties, no spikes, no metal. Just the overgrown scar and the faint impression of a forgotten path. I cross-referenced their location with historical maps. The old roadbed was indeed marked on some very early survey documents dating back to the late 1800s. It was identified as a logging track, built to haul timber out of the preserve, long before the land was officially designated as such. There was no mention of a rail line ever being constructed there. It was a simple dirt track, abandoned when the timber was exhausted. The cable scar Deputy Chen described was likely a remnant of the logging operation, perhaps for hauling logs up the slope or for a temporary tramway.
but certainly not a full-scale railway. The deputies spent another half hour meticulously searching the immediate vicinity of the old roadbed. They took several photographs of the overgrown scar and the briar-choked path. The cold was setting in, and the fog had thickened, reducing visibility to a few yards. They reported no further anomalies, no sounds, no lights, nothing out of place beyond the strange, forgotten landscape itself. With no sign of a person and no indication of distress, I authorized them to return to their patrol. They logged their findings, noting the unusual nature of the call and the lack of any concrete explanation. The incident was filed as an unfounded welfare check. The cell ping remained an isolated data point, its origin unexplained. We never received another call from that number, nor did any other pings register from the Blackwood Preserve. The photographs taken by the deputies showed only dense forest, the faint outline of the old logging track, and the tangled briars. There was nothing in the evidence to suggest anything beyond a technical glitch or a momentary, inexplicable signal bounce. I reviewed the dispatch audio logs several times in the following days. The locomotive whistle was undeniably there, clear and distinct, bleeding into the recording of my own voice as I acknowledged the cell ping. It was a sound that simply did not belong. The official report noted the unidentified audio anomaly, but offered no explanation. It was a procedural detail, a footnote in a quiet file. Sometimes, late at night, when the dispatch room is still and the radio hums with distant static, I still hear it. It's not a physical sound, but an echo in my memory. That long, mournful whistle carrying across miles of empty forest, from a place where no train has ever run.